I'm Dr. Regina Koepp. I'm a board-certified clinical psychologist, and I specialize with older adults and families. I created the Psychology of Aging podcast to dispel myths about aging, destigmatize mental health for older adults, and improve access to mental health care. Whether you're an older adult, a family member caring for an older adult, or a professional working with older adults, you're in the right place. And one more thing. If you're a licensed mental health provider like a social worker, psychologist, counselor, therapist, or an aging life care expert or certified care manager looking for continuing education focused on mental health and aging, simply go to mentalhealthandaging.com to learn more about how to earn your CEUs. All right, let's jump into today's episode. In today's episode, I interview Paige Ulrey, who's the Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney for the King County Prosecutor's Office in Washington State. Today, Paige is on the podcast talking with us about the impact of elder abuse on older adults, barriers to reporting elder abuse cases, how we can improve the reporting system. We each have a role. She'll describe some of the common elder abuse cases that she sees, and then gives lots of recommendations for mandated reporters and for loved ones who are concerned about an older adult, as well as for older adults themselves. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Paige Ulrey. Paige Ulrey is the Senior Deputy Prosecuting Attorney for the King County Prosecutor's Office. She graduated from Amherst College and Northeastern University School of Law. She began her career at the King County Prosecutor's Office in 1998, and in 2001 was appointed to the newly created position of Elder Abuse Prosecutor in the Criminal Division. In that position, she prosecutes cases of elder and vulnerable adult neglect, financial exploitation, sexual assault, physical assault, and homicide. Paige conducts training and curriculum development on elder abuse prosecution and investigation around the country and internationally. She has testified before the U.S. Senate Special Committee on Aging and has twice spoken at White House conferences on elder justice. Let's jump into the episode with Paige Ulrey. Thank you so much for joining me on the Psychology of Aging podcast. I know you're busy as a prosecutor, but your willingness to be here is going to help a lot of people. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Regina. I'm really excited to be here. Thank you.
Can you share a little bit about what inspired you to specialize with older adults and elder abuse in your role or in your career?
Sure. I was happily working away in the domestic violence unit of the prosecutor's office, and unbeknownst to me, my boss, who was our elected prosecutor at the time, Norm Mailing, who is really kind of a legend in tackling progressive issues and really embracing change and novel ways of handling things. He was working on creating a position of elder abuse prosecutor in the office, and he asked me to do it, and I had no idea what I was getting into. But I thought it sounded important and interesting, and so I said yes. So it was completely random that I ended up getting involved in this.
Why do you suppose he chose you?
That's a great question. I don't know. I think I am a hard worker. I think I connect with people. He probably recognized that the job would require someone with a lot of tenacity and sort of a willingness to sort of do whatever is needed. And I think that described me at that time. So I don't know, but I was lucky that he chose me.
Can you just educate us about what a prosecutor is and what a prosecutor's role is in elder abuse cases?
So a prosecutor is someone who works for either a city or a state or the federal government who brings criminal charges on behalf of that, basically of the city, state, or federal government against somebody for violating a crime. So it's a very broad category of attorneys.
And then a role in elder abuse cases, is it unique or is it pretty standard?
It is very unique. When I was appointed to the position in 2001, there were only very few elder abuse prosecutors in the country. We are very behind, as I'm sure you know, in how we respond to elder abuse. And so at that point, which in the early 2000s, very, very few prosecutors' offices were even charging these cases, were even bringing these cases. And beyond that, there were incredibly few people who were dedicating themselves to elder abuse prosecution. So we say that we were where we were with domestic violence like 40 years ago. That's where we are now with regard to elder abuse. We've got a long way to go before we start responding to it properly. Okay.
So you said compared to domestic violence cases, elder abuse is currently where domestic violence prosecution was 40 years ago. What do we need to do to make that, to catch up?
We need a lot of things. We need dedicated and trained elder abuse prosecutors and detectives. Prosecutors can't do it without having the law enforcement agencies to back them up and to actually investigate the cases, and vice versa. Detectives who are dedicated to doing elder abuse cases can't bring those cases unless there's a prosecutor there to prosecute them. We need much more funding for training and for community education on reporting and recognizing elder abuse. We just need a general increase in awareness and alarm, really, about this issue. It is an alarming issue, and yet very few people are even keyed into what it's about and to how often it's happening. So that means a lot of people aren't reporting it. A lot of people who are receiving those reports aren't trained in identifying these cases and knowing when they're criminal and when they're civil. And so we are failing on many levels with regard to how we respond to it.
Wow. And multiple systems, not just one system, is failing.
Exactly.
It's a collaborative effort to make sure that all of the reports are made and received and processed, and there's training at every level that's needed.
Exactly. So we have people in emergency rooms who are, social workers and nurses and doctors who are seeing some of these cases and not knowing if what they're seeing is criminal or not. And it's hard to report. It's a heavy lift to report. So they may say, well, I'm sure they're doing the best they can. I don't think this is something we need to report. And so, the case dies on the vine right there. Or we'll see someone who actually is alarmed about something and they call 911, and the dispatch person, also not trained on elder abuse, says, oh, I don't think that's criminal. I think you need to call a civil attorney or call APS. And so then that case dies on the vine. And so there's all these different places where the ball is being dropped. And as a result, very often nothing is happening in response to what could be a really dangerous and deadly situation for somebody.
Yeah, you just answered the next question, which is, so then what happens if it goes unreported? And
yeah, nothing. And so the abuse or the neglect or the exploitation continues. And, the elder may lose everything they have. They may die from the neglect. They may die from the abuse. We see a lot of really, really serious cases, and there's no question that the impact of any form of elder abuse, including financial exploitation, is absolutely devastating. There was one study done by Mark Lax at Cornell Medical School that said that any form of elder abuse, including financial exploitation, increases the risk of premature death in the elderly by 300%. So you're 3 times more likely to die a premature death if you're the victim of any form of abuse and you're older.
Wow. I need to include that study on the show notes. That is powerful. Will you say that statistic one more time?
Sure. Any form of elder abuse, including financial exploitation, increases the risk of premature death by 300%.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's significant. That is more than significant. And
the part of it that is the most striking to me is the financial exploitation part. Like, it's not surprising someone would die of neglect or physical abuse, but the financial exploitation part, when I first heard that statistic, was surprising to me. But now, as I look back on my cases and I think about it, I've just realized that it's true. We see so many victims of financial exploitation who just become so disheartened after they discover what's happened to them that they become ill and very often don't survive.
Calling all mental health providers. Have you been feeling ineffective, stuck, or unsure of how to best help your client with memory loss? Well, it's not your fault. Most therapists haven't had any training in addressing memory loss or cognitive changes in therapy. But I got something for you. In my free 10-minute video where I walk you through 5 steps for helping your clients presenting with memory loss, you'll learn the difference between memory loss and mental health concerns for older adults and how to help. Get this free training and a bonus workbook that you can start using in your clinic today. Simply go to www.mentalhealthandaging.com www.mentalhealthandaging.com/clarity to learn more. That's www.mentalhealthandaging.com/clarity. CLARITY. Oh, and mistrusting, I'm sure. And
Yeah,
because the majority of abuse happens with people we know.
exactly. So they become mistrusting of other people and also mistrusting of their own ability to perceive who is good for them and who's not good for them.
Yeah. So their self-confidence and self-assuredness is diminished.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oof, this is heavy stuff.
I know. Sorry to be a downer.
Oh. So what are some of the most common elder abuse cases that you see?
Well, in general, in the office, our elder abuse unit focuses primarily on financial exploitation and neglect. But we also do some sexual assault cases and some physical abuse cases. So we're not seeing all of the cases that come in. We did a study with Department of Justice a number of years ago on our filed criminal felony level cases. And that study revealed that the majority of cases we see are financial exploitation involving victims 65 and over. And I think second most common is physical abuse. And then neglect and sexual assault are a very small percentage, not because they're not happening, but because I think there's even more issues with regard to reporting them.
And I think I heard a statistic that financial exploitation is the most reported type of abuse than any of the others. Is that your
That is my
understanding?
perception. Yeah. And it probably is also the most frequent. But there's no question that we're seeing, only a tiny fraction of the cases of sexual abuse and neglect that are happening as well. Well, there's more, especially with neglect, it's really hard for people to understand, whether what they're seeing is due to underlying disease and underlying complications someone might be suffering from versus lack of proper care. And the other complicating factor for all of these types of crimes is that consent is the most common defense. I guess the one exception to that is physical abuse, but with regard to neglect, sexual abuse, and financial exploitation, the refrain that we hear all the time from perpetrators is, this is what they wanted, this is what the victim wanted. And so that brings us to capacity. Does the person have capacity to be consenting to whatever the act is that's at issue? And that capacity is just so important, not only to help us figure out whether they're consenting, but also just to make sure we understand what services they need, and obviously to understand whether we should even be getting involved or not, because we have the right to spend our money how we want to have sexual contact with whoever we want to refuse medical care if we have capacity. So that's a really central question in many, many of our cases.
And capacity is so complicated because it's determined for this point in time, not determined in perpetuity or indefinitely. And so
Exactly.
Capacity can change. And,
right.
And it's so hard to get a sense of, especially if you're going to prosecute something, did they have capacity then, even if they don't have capacity now?
Exactly, Regina. And because of the lack of reporting, we often don't hear about these cases until long afterwards. So we're frequently in the position of trying to figure out, did this person have capacity 2 or 3 years ago? And that becomes even more complicated.
Yeah. I mean, capacity is a big conversation in regards to dementia because of changes in the brain over time. And one of, it's so tricky because even if a person has capacity to make medical decisions, they might not have capacity to drive a car or manage their money. And what they say about somebody with dementia is, once you see one person with dementia, you see one person with dementia. It's hard to generalize what it's like to be living with dementia. So to try to make a retroactive judgment about a person's capacity is incredibly complicated.
Exactly. And a lot of jurisdictions that I've worked with don't even have or use capacity evaluators. So all they're doing is looking back at the primary care provider's records to see if someone had capacity at a particular time. And that, as you can imagine, is extremely, it just does not give you what you need in order to make a decision like that.
My jaw was dropping when you said that, because for the people who are listening, because, I would be asked to do capacity evaluations from primary care because sometimes capacity is pretty clear when communicating with somebody regarding certain things like money or, but capacity around sexual intimacy, or which is so nuanced and doesn't necessarily always require a verbal response. It's so much more complicated than just a primary care provider could assess in a 15-minute encounter with a patient. I just remember like also receiving lots of, I was embedded in a geriatric primary care clinic and then connected to an outpatient mental health clinic for a geriatric primary care and a geriatric mental health clinic. And I remember physicians saying, can you do a capacity evaluation? And then I would have to say, on what domain? Regarding what? Regarding finances, regarding medical decision-making, regarding sexual decision-making? What are you asking about? And they would say, like, I don't know, tell me what all the options are. So we need training there too.
We do indeed. And what happens in a criminal case, which is so difficult, is that we will bring a case. This is actually a fairly common scenario, and it's usually a financial exploitation case, but we'll bring a case. And when we get the case, the person has dementia, but it's really unclear how impaired they are. And there's a consent defense that's raised. And so we're in the position of having to figure out if this person had capacity to consent to this complicated financial situation or this transaction, I guess. And we will get the primary care provider's records, and there's nothing in there, or else there maybe is a mini mental status exam, and that's it. So very minimal screening for dementia. And then we will go ahead and have a full-blown capacity evaluation done. And lo and behold, the person has moderate, if not even more advanced dementia, and they completely lack capacity to make financial decisions. And when we go to trial, what ends up happening is the defense will call the primary care provider as a witness to reinforce their claim that the victim had capacity. And it's just a very awkward situation, and not one that I think is very comfortable for a doctor to be called into in that kind of situation. But it's a great example of what happens when we don't deal with these issues up front and really work on doing better assessments and screening.
Yeah. And then that physician sort of, has to navigate managed care and the timeframes of managed care. And especially geriatricians do capacity much better. They generally have more time with patients. So there's more room to do that, and more training, like you're saying.
But when they 15 minutes, how do you do, the screening? It's really an impossible request, I think.
Yeah. And often if people have diminished capacity, their family members there and has lots of questions. And so how do you really, make the time for all of that? It's an impossible position to even put the physician, the primary care provider that doesn't have the designated time in.
Exactly. Like our system is not built to really handle this kind of situation. That's right.
Yeah. Well, you're the person to help us understand how to make it better. So I'm glad that you're here and giving us some insights. And I know at the end, we're going to have some tips for what people can do, whatever role, how to be aware and what you can do if you're concerned, regardless of your role or whatever role you're in. What do you suppose are some barriers to people reporting even elder abuse cases?
I think there's a lot of concern on the part of professionals with regard to infringing on their patients or their clients' privacy rights. And it's so different than when you're talking about a child, because obviously there's no privacy interest and you can report anything, and it's just a much easier thing to do. But when you're talking about someone who's in their 70s or 80s or 90s who is making their own decisions, to be working with them and say, hey, sorry, I think you're doing something that is, not okay, and I think you're being victimized, and I'm going to call Adult Protective Services or the police. It's a very, intrusive thing to do. And if you have a relationship with that person, you may be afraid of them, not coming back to you if you're a doctor, for instance, or you may be afraid of losing their business if you're a financial advisor. There's just a lot of impediments that make it very, very difficult for people, especially if they're not really sure if they're right. So it's just easy to sort of say to yourself, it's probably not, I'm just going to let it go and sort of see what happens. So there's just huge difficulties, I think, on the part of professionals. And then with regard to family members, I think there's a fear of also angering the person, if it's your parent or your grandparent or whoever, alienating them or angering them. And if, you could be afraid you're going to lose their trust in you if you report something. And then there's also just a stigma, I think, about being a victim. There's a stigma about having dementia, and no one really wants to believe that this person that they love has dementia. And by sort of pulling that cover back or revealing that, you could be having to deal with something that's very painful for you and for that person. So a lot of people would just prefer to kind of ignore whatever the problem is and just hope for the best. But usually that ignoring of those red flags doesn't help things. And in the end, it ends up causing a lot more harm.
Yeah, back to that 300%.
Right, exactly. I think another barrier is that a lot of people don't get a good response from the system, right? So like we were talking about earlier, a lot of people might report to APS and not, be happy with APS's response, either because APS decides there's nothing wrong or because APS may be too aggressive in how they respond. And same with law enforcement. Law enforcement may say, this is civil, this isn't anything we can do, or be aggressive. In some jurisdictions, we're seeing a lot of very aggressive responses by law enforcement now with regard to elder abuse. So it's just a fear, I think, and a lot of inconsistency with regard to how the system responds when someone does report.
Mm-hmm. That's very helpful clarification. I mean, just these examples are so helpful. They're triggering or sparking in me some examples of my own clinical work when I've had to report. And yes, I had to report a case where a person with significant disability required full care, was reporting emotional harm from their partner. And so I consulted with the team who was working with me and in his care. And we all agreed, yes, it needed to be reported. And that helped to have a team that I could balance, is this my own fear about how he's being treated, or is this accurate? What do you all think? Is he reporting this to me? Is he reporting that to you? And if we all had consent to consult on his care, and in terms of, releases of information, we were all in the same care team. And it helped me so much to have this care team to say, yes, it's reportable. You need to report it.
Definitely.
And when it was horrible for me and horrible for him. And he ended up not working with me anymore. He felt I had betrayed his trust. Naturally, when I told him I would be filing the report, and I understood that it was a betrayal of his trust, and I, apologized, and he didn't want to work with me anymore. And I understood, even though I was heartbroken. And to sort of finish out the story, several months later, he did return to mental health care with somebody else, thankfully, not with me, which I understand. But he did return to mental health care. And I think that the transparency of how I told him my steps, and that I was terribly sorry, but the team and I agreed that we needed to report it, I think helped him to remain trusting enough of the mental health system that he could continue to work with somebody, even though that person wasn't me. But just, it's so hard. It is incredibly painful. I think that another barrier that I hear from physicians and mental health providers is around, does the person have diminished capacity to be exploited? So if they're an adult and they don't have a significant disability, like a developmental disability, and they don't have dementia, but they're being financially exploited, or, maybe some other type of abuse or harm, is that reportable? And like if they're in an abusive partnership, a romantic partnership, or they're being financially exploited, but there's no diminished capacity. How is that? Clinicians often sort of wonder about that. Is that reportable?
Yeah, that's a great question. It just depends on your state's mandatory reporting laws. Some states have require that anyone who is over 60 or over 65 is considered an elder, and any abuse, neglect, or exploitation of that person must be reported by mandatory reporters. Other jurisdictions require a vulnerability. So someone could be 95, but not have any cognitive impairment or physical impairment and not be considered a vulnerable adult, and therefore it doesn't have to be reported. So that it really depends on your state's laws. I think most, if not all states do have a law that says that reporting in good faith gives you immunity. So even if you're wrong, like my feeling is better to report and be wrong than not report at all. And even if you're wrong, you're still going to be hopefully revealing a situation that someone can do something about, and you're not going to be liable for doing that as long as you make the report in good faith.
That's a helpful clarification, and for a reminder to folks to check your jurisdiction for your own state rules around mandatory reporting for elders.
Exactly. The other thing that we're lacking is coordination between disciplines. These cases are inherently multidisciplinary. So in almost every case, we're dealing with capacity, like we've talked about, or we're dealing with medical issues, or both. We may be dealing with financial issues. We may be dealing with social issues and housing issues and legal issues. And so, the bringing together disciplines to discuss a particular case is a really important thing to do. And it's starting to become the gold standard for how we respond to elder abuse. So all over the country, multidisciplinary teams are being formed in different jurisdictions. And they usually consist of a geriatrician, a capacity evaluator, APS, law enforcement, a prosecutor, a financial analyst, someone who might have expertise in mental health or developmental disabilities. And the idea of these teams is that they come together to staff difficult cases and together to figure out what's the best path forward for this person. And it may be prosecution, it may not be. It may be that the team decides this person actually has capacity and that what they're doing is their choice and they're freely choosing to do this, so we shouldn't be intervening. It may just be services. There's a wide variety of different options, but there's no question that we make our best decisions when we're as informed as we can be, and having that multidisciplinary perspective is how we are best informed to make good choices for people. And so that's really an important thing that is starting to happen around the country.
Even outside of the elder abuse discussion around determining sexual consent capacity in long-term care communities, the recommendation or the gold standard is a team approach too, even outside of this judicial system. So if someone is living in a long-term care community and starting a romantic relationship, and maybe both members of that relationship, or maybe multiple members, some people are polyamorous, multiple members have dementia and diminished capacity. The standard is that a team is created to assess the person's capacity to consent, that it's not one person making that assessment regarding sexual decision-making capacity in long-term care with diminished capacity. And that's because we could, it's so nuanced. The sexual interactions are so nuanced where we could be okay with one sex act with one partner, but not that same sex act with a different partner. We could be okay with one sex act with one partner and then try a different sex act and not be comfortable, right? But maybe comfortable with something else. Right. And so every sort of moment in an intimate interaction, we're giving consent or dissent, right? And so it's incredibly complex and also very human. And yes, it's a natural part of human expression more than spending money. So, so the team is the gold standard there as well. So I'm glad to hear that more and more teams are forming around even these elder abuse cases.
That's fantastic. I didn't know about that. And I think that's a really, really wonderful way to deal with a very complicated question. Yeah. It's great.
Well, and even just back to that, what seemed straightforward, a person with severe disability being harmed by his spouse or partner. And that it helped me so much to have a team. Even though I was a mandated reporter, I had to report on my own, just to have a team of people that I could say, this is happening. One, they could help me kind of carry the weight of making this kind of a report that does affect a person's life on many levels. And just, that's a heavy thing to carry for one person.
And then for the patient or the client to hear that the team talked about it, and we hashed it out, and this was the collective decision of the team, I think might help them realize this isn't a personality problem, and sort of might help them trust your opinion more, your collective opinion more.
Yeah. Yes.
I had started a neglect team long ago when I first started in doing this work, because I started out just bringing neglect cases. And we also had a medical ethicist as part of our team, which was a really wonderful addition. We don't have one now, but I wish we did, because I think that person can really add a lot to those conversations.
Oh, yeah. I completely agree. I completely agree. Yeah. The more multidisciplinary I think you can make a team, the stronger the outcomes, I think, will be.
Exactly.
Now, speaking of neglect, so we've been talking about pretty overt cases like financial exploitation or sexual harm or physical harm. What about neglect? So neglect is often overlooked as an abuse. Can you sort of tell us a little bit about what neglect cases can look like and how we can navigate those?
Sure. Like, I am looking at the worst of the worst, Regina. So the cases that I see, the neglect cases that I see, are felony level cases. So usually the victim is severely injured, and often they're dead. So we will end up getting a case from law enforcement where the police will have been called out to a scene, and the elder or the person with developmental disabilities is someone who's usually bedbound with a lot of medical issues. And the thing that makes it a neglect case is that there's a caregiver, someone's responsible for their care, and that person has neglected their responsibilities and failed to provide them with proper care. And that lack of proper care, not their underlying conditions, but the lack of proper care, has resulted in significant injury or death. Usually these cases involve malnutrition, dehydration, pressure sores or bed sores, and result in death. That's the majority of cases that I see. So they're pretty horrific cases when you look at the photographs, or for law enforcement when you go out to the scene. But the issue for us criminally is making sure that this caregiver is someone who had the tools to care for this person and who chose not to. And usually the kind of case that we end up actually bringing charges in is a case where the person was financially motivated not to provide care. So it's that we need usually some motive that's very, very evident, like money, in order to bring a case like that. Because most often, if there isn't a motive, it's because the person is neglected because the caregiver may have their own disabilities. They may be an adult child of the victim, and always they followed their parents' wishes. And so when their parents said, "Leave me alone," they did. It may be that the parent really did want to die at home. I mean, there's a lot of different variations that it could make a case simply not be appropriate for criminal charging. But then occasionally there's a case where it's very clear the caregiver did have the tools emotionally and mentally to provide care to this person, and they had a gambling addiction or they had a drug addiction, and they chose to spend their money for themselves rather than for getting proper care for this person. And that's when it may be a criminal case.
Wow. Yeah. How often are these criminal cases tried, and what's the proper term? Prevailed or
resulted in a conviction?
Okay.
Yeah. They're pretty rare still. I have I've filed charges maybe in 10 or 15 cases in my career. Most often we'll get a case and we'll decide it's not appropriate for criminal charging. But once in a while we see a case and we will bring it because it's very obvious this person suffered tremendously and they didn't need to have suffered like that. And then around the country, there's more and more prosecutors who are starting to bring these cases, but as far as neglect is concerned, that's still an area where a lot of people don't have the training or the resources to investigate and prosecute those cases properly. And so we don't see a lot of prosecutions nationally of neglect.
Mm-hmm. Tell us, what's the difference between civil and criminal cases?
So civil cases are cases that where someone, either a family member or a victim themselves, files a lawsuit against a perpetrator or against someone who had a duty to them, and asks for money in return for this breach of duty. So you might see an elder abuse, you might bring a case against, a very common scenario is a family member will bring a case against a nursing home or another long-term care facility for neglect of their family member in the facility. That's probably the most common form of civil elder abuse case that we see. There are a lot of other cases that could be brought, cases of financial exploitation or physical abuse, but usually the perpetrator doesn't have assets. Not always, but usually. So if they don't have assets, a family member might reach out to a lawyer and say, look, I want to sue this person who abused my mom or exploited my mom. But then the lawyer investigates it, and the exploiter or the abuser doesn't have any resources. They don't own their own home. They don't have insurance. There's no way they can get any money from that person. So the civil case ends there because there's no point in suing someone unless you can get money from them. You may also be able to sue a financial institution if they breach their fiduciary duty by, allowing an exploiter to get money from the elder inappropriately. And then a criminal case is not brought by an individual. It's brought by a municipality or a state or local government or the federal government where a crime has occurred. So if we file charges as criminal cases, we are the state of Washington. The state of Washington is prosecuting this person for having committed this crime. And the remedy is not money. The remedy is treatment, jail time, prison time, no contact orders, maybe restitution. Sometimes if it's a financial case, we can get the court to order that the offender repay the victim, but usually the offender has spent the money, and so that the victim never gets their money back. But so it's two different things. One is pursuing damages for a wrong that's been done to you by someone who has a duty to you in some way, and the other is pursuing a punishment for someone who has committed a crime against you. That's the difference between civil and criminal. But the other thing that's important in a criminal case is that it's the state bringing the case, not the individual. So prosecutors' offices may bring a case even if a victim says, I don't want you to bring this case because that's my son and I love him. But the prosecutor still has the power to do that. Usually the prosecutor will, and they should, consult with the victim and see what the victim wants. But in some cases, the person presents such a danger to the community that the state has to prosecute them anyway. It sort of depends on the situation. Mm-hmm. In my experience, we give a lot more deference to victims of financial exploitation than we do of neglect or physical or sexual abuse. So if a victim of financial exploitation says, look, that's my son, he's my only heir, he wasn't entitled to my money, but I really don't want him prosecuted because he's the only person I have left in the world, we may well defer to their wishes or try to figure out treatment or something else that's less punitive than jail or prison time.
Mm-hmm. That's a helpful clarification. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So now what are the recommendations for, I know we gave some recommendations for mandated reporters, that it's really important to look up in your jurisdiction what the mandated reporting laws are for elder abuse. But what about for concerned family members or caregivers? If they're concerned about a loved one who might be exploited or being harmed, what should they do?
Well, I think, I think they should act versus not acting. I mean, I think the regret that I have witnessed by family members is for not intervening soon enough and for assuming things are okay because the elder has told them to leave them alone or has said everything's fine and they haven't looked further. So I think, if it's financial exploitation and you're a family member, I would talk to the elder about it, really try to convince them that you're not going to take away their rights, but you just need to sort of see what's going on and ask them if you can look at their financial situation. Ideally, if it's a responsible adult family member, they could get their names on their accounts or just be allowed to have access to the parent's account or the elder's account so they can just be checking periodically to make sure everything's okay. And then if they're not sure and the elder is very reluctant to allow them to do anything, it gets really complicated. I mean, I think in that case, I might call the police, call APS and see if they're willing to help. If they're not, I might call an elder law attorney. There's a lot of really wonderful elder law attorneys out there. And in some cases that are kind of too nuanced or where there's not enough information, they end up being the people who can help the most. And they can look into the situation and see if a protection order is appropriate or see if a report to APS or law enforcement is appropriate and help with that. And maybe help. There's in Washington, and I think in other states as well, you can get a protection order that just prevents the suspect or the perpetrator from having access to the elder's accounts. So it doesn't cut them out of their life. It just prevents this potential exploitation from happening.
Access.
There's a lot of, there's a lot more sensitive responses that can come through a protection order, maybe than through bringing criminal charges. So that's, and then, another option is just to talk to the elder themselves, as I've said, talk to other family members, really try to network about it within your own family if you can, and sort of collect your knowledge and your concerns, and then sit down with the elder and talk to them about it. And if they're adamantly refusing to respond to your questions, and for instance, if you think they're being scammed and it's not, the perpetrator is someone who clearly does not have a legitimate relationship with them, then taking much more proactive action is probably appropriate.
Yeah.
The scam question is a really big one. We have so many people calling us who have a family member who's caught up in a scam, and they're so often reluctant to come forward about it because they're afraid if they report this to the family or to the police or anything, they're going to lose the chance to get this money that they're expecting to get back. So there's, or they'll be deemed to be incapacitated and they'll lose their independence, or they'll end up in a nursing home. There's all these very legitimate fears on the part of older adults to revealing when they may be when they're being victimized. So kind of addressing those concerns with the family member and trying to work with them is the first thing I would try.
That's very helpful. And what about for vulnerable older adults? What would you recommend for them? Because we don't want older adults, I struggle with these. These are such essential conversations, and raising awareness is so important. Elder abuse is not the norm. The majority of older adults are not being exploited or abused.
Yes.
But what would you say to older adults who are vulnerable, who do rely on others, even if they can make their own decisions and do have capacity? What would you recommend for them just to safeguard their wellness and their sense of security?
I mean, one thing that's a big issue that we see is older adults putting their trust in a family member who has an addiction of some kind. It's amazing how many of our cases of financial exploitation involve people who are gambling or shopping addicts. So if you are the parent or the grandparent or the uncle or the aunt of someone who has an addiction like that, don't let them be your power of attorney. It's just a recipe for disaster. So just making sure that person doesn't have access to your money and isn't your bill payer is one really good preventative step I would take. Also talking to multiple family members, if you have them, about being co-power of attorney for you, or assuming joint responsibility so that there's eyes on each other is another really good thing to do. And just reaching out to your community, about concerns you might have. And I think the more we accept the fact that abuse and neglect and exploitation happens, the less shame there is around it. And just realizing that if this is happening to you, or you're afraid it's happening to you, it is not your fault. There's so many people who I've talked to who've been victimized, and they've said afterwards, I just felt so stupid. How could I be so stupid? And it's not you, it's them. They're the problem. And don't be ashamed, and just be proud and talk to other people about it and talk about your concerns and your fears. I think that's probably the most important advice I could give to somebody.
I love that. That you don't hold the shame. It's the perpetrator who the shame belongs to, not to you.
That's right. That's right.
Do you have any other guidance for mandated reporters?
Just being aware of the fact that I think in every state you're going to be protected as long as you report in good faith. And then, realizing that it's not your job to investigate, it's the job of the investigators. And if it's a case also where you really are convinced something serious is going on and you report and you don't get a response, don't give up and call back and to ask for a supervisor. If it's the police, ask for a sergeant. If the police say to you, sorry, this is civil, and someone's being financially ravaged by in an exploitation situation, look at the website for the local prosecutor's office and see if they have an elder abuse prosecutor, or turn to someone else, a civil attorney who might be able to help you. But just don't give up, because if you think something's going on, you're probably right. And the more you can do, the better off the elder is going to be in the end.
Yeah, thank you. I was just thinking too, it can help to get, if you do file with APS, the case number. So then when you follow up, you'll have the case number and the name of the person who took the case number, or whoever the case manager is that's assigned to that case number to. I've talked to many, a case manager assigned to a case number and had success following up in that way. So that can be a helpful path to navigating the APS system.
Absolutely, Regina. And the same is true for law enforcement. You also get a case number from law enforcement. And so you can call back and say, I made this report last week. I haven't heard anything. Can you tell me where it is? And then if they say, oh, it's civil, we can't help you, then ask if you can talk to a sergeant or someone higher up and see if you can appeal to them.
And that's especially important for documentation too, and the medical record. And it can help the whole team to know so that they can follow up as needed as well. So it just can smooth out all the wrinkles in the system.
Exactly.
And back to that collaboration you were talking about.
Exactly. And also for people who are seeing someone in a clinical setting, taking notes about what you're seeing. And if there are statements that the elder makes to you, if you can take them down verbatim, that is really great. And same with if there's a caregiver who you think is abusing or exploiting them, taking down any statements they make verbatim, that your record is something that we can get into court, even if we lose the victim by the time of the trial, which happens rather frequently. But we can still prove a case oftentimes through statements that were made to you as a healthcare provider, because that's admissible as non-hearsay. So that is really wonderfully helpful to us. So anything like that is very, very important to us, figuring out, if someone had diminished capacity or if there was a criminal incident involving them.
For the resources that you mentioned around finding an elder care attorney and other reporting resources, I can put all of those in the show notes. I have them on a few episodes ago. I did an elder abuse kind of resource episode. And so I'll make sure that all of those resources are here in the show notes. So around where to find an elder attorney, how to report if you're concerned, and even tips for long-term care communities and when to call in an ombudsman, and all of those sort of reporting even in long-term care.
Great idea. And the ombudsman is really a wonderful person we didn't mention before, but such an essential player in the long-term care setting. They're fantastic advocates for people.
One of the concerns that I hear from long-term care communities or personal care homes are that if they bring in an ombudsman from the state that to help with, to be an advocate for a resident, that will look negatively on the long-term care community in terms of and they're afraid of citations with the state and maintaining their license to have a long-term care community with the state. What are your thoughts about that? And what is the role of an ombudsman?
Well, it's very different from the role of the state licensing agency, and that will definitely reflect on their record and be public information if there's a finding made against the facility. But as I understand it, the ombudsman is there as an advocate for the resident. And if the resident is so impaired they can't consent to an ombudsman being involved, then it would be that person's representative, so their guardian or their power of attorney. But they cannot release information unless they have permission from the resident or their representative. So it's highly confidential. So I don't think it would be, a mark on the facility unless there was something reported to the state. And they're not mandatory reporters. They wouldn't be reporting to the state unless they had the permission of the resident, as I understand it. At least that's true in Washington state. So, but more than anyone, they are this resource for the community and for family members because they know what's going on at these facilities, and they will advocate for residents in a way that is just so important. I think it's just, I can't emphasize enough what key players they are to addressing abuse, neglect, and exploitation in long-term care facilities.
Can you explain a little bit about what an ombudsman is? So I know they're a resident advocate. And so what is their role as an advocate?
As I understand it, and I'm really not an expert, but as I understand it, they field complaints from residents or their families, and then they advocate for them with the facility. So if someone is, being exploited in a facility by a staff person, they'll reach out to the facility and they'll work with them to make sure the facility takes the proper action to stop the exploitation. And then I believe with the permission of the resident, they will then report if that's what the resident wants. So they're trying to remedy whatever wrong is that the resident is experiencing. And it could be something as dramatic as exploitation, but it also could be something as mild as just the food being lousy and the resident wanting decent meals at the place where they live, or a privacy issues, people not being treated respectfully, or, interference in their decisions that they make about who they're intimate with. All those kinds of things are things I believe that they will get involved with.
Yeah, I think that would be like my second career, is to be an ombudsman.
And they have volunteer ombudsmen. So a lot of the states, maybe not all of them, will train people to volunteer and to go into facilities and just spend a few hours a week or a month helping be the eyes and ears of the ombudsman's office in those facilities.
And the ombudsman's office is connected to the state. Is that right?
Right. That's correct.
But not to the state licensing board.
Right. Not connected to DSHS or whatever your state licensor is called. Totally separate from them. And but there is one in every state, I believe. Yes, I think there's one in every state.
And they have some great resources. So I can also link to the state ombudsman website. They have great resources for families and older adults as well.
Excellent.
Yeah. Well, Paige Ulrey, thank you so much for joining me today. You have just laid out so much wisdom and resources and recommendations. I'm hoping that thousands of people working in senior care and mental health will listen and take action when they see something that they're concerned about. So thank
Regina,
you.
Thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. And it's just such a pleasure and honor to be here. So thanks so much.
So the National Center on Elder Abuse and the Keck School of Medicine at USC, the University of Southern California, collaborated on creating a list of 12 things everyone can do to prevent elder abuse. And I'll link to this in the show notes. But here are a couple of the items that they list. One is to learn the signs of elder abuse and neglect and how we can collectively solve the issue. So one of the ways that I am helping to solve the issue is by raising awareness. One of the ways that you are helping is by listening and perhaps sharing this episode and raising awareness with your friends. Another thing that you can do is to prevent isolation. So you could call or visit your older loved ones and ask how they're doing. You could send a letter to, if you're concerned about an older adult and you're concerned about their how they're taking care of themselves. If you're concerned about self-neglect, you can let their primary care provider know. Faxing or emailing information is sometimes more preferred than phone call because it more often ends up in the chart, in the medical record. As I mentioned earlier, when caregivers are stressed out and burned out and at their wits' end, it can often help to encourage respite or even give caregivers in your life a break just by offering to spend time with the person that your friend is caring for, the caregiver is caring for. So offer and encourage breaks for caregivers either through national respite programs, and I can link to those, or just by offering a break. In long-term care communities, it can help to have an ombudsman to serve as a resident advocate if there are concerns about abuse or risk, or if family members, what I hear often is an older adult is in a nursing home or a long-term care residence, and their family member is concerned about how they're doing or how they're being treated in that community. And maybe especially during COVID, when we couldn't go and physically see our loved ones, there were a lot of concerns, like if you're noticing bruises or there are complaints about pain or restriction of medications, you can, I would encourage you to talk with the director of nursing and the executive director first. And if that's not resolving the issue, then I would encourage you to consider an ombudsman. An ombudsman is generally a not-for-profit person, a nonprofit person who is designated by the state to go and assist older adults and adults with disabilities and be an advocate for them, especially in long-term care communities. Because financial exploitation is one of the most reported types of elder abuse, I'm really looking forward to giving you some resources that Peter Lichtenberg and his lab put together at Wayne State. Their website is called olderadultnestegg.com. It's all free, it's all credible, and it has great resources for older adults, for caregivers, and for professionals. Caregivers are often in a bind related to financial exploitation because if you are a caregiver and you're caring for an older loved one, especially if you're an adult child or a family member, not a spouse, it can get pretty messy if you and your loved one are mingling funds or commingling funds, financial funds or bank accounts. It can get pretty messy. And so it can help to have a guide for what to do in those situations. And that older adult nest egg is really great for that. And like I said, in a couple of weeks, we'll have Peter Lichtenberg on the podcast sharing some resources and talking about that more deeply as well. So now what can you do if you suspect abuse? So many people who listen to this podcast are mandated reporters. And I'm hoping that you have some information about what you would do if you needed to report a suspected abuse situation or self-neglect situation. I would encourage you to communicate with if you work in a healthcare system, to communicate with your legal team. If you can always call Adult Protective Services to learn more about what constitutes abuse. But anyone can really make a report. If you suspect abuse, if you're a caregiver, you can make a report and you can do something about it. The first thing you can do is kind of pay attention to the warning signs and the objective signs that you're noticing. Next week, Kathy Schottenstein-Paddock talks about some of the signs that she was made aware of and how hard it was to actually move toward the signs and how enticing it was to not take on the challenge of confronting family members about financial exploitation. But if you are aware of the warning signs, please don't ignore them. The first is to acknowledge them, recognize them, and then report the situation so it can be investigated. You are not required to investigate. That's what we have these other third-party resources to do, like Adult Protective Services to do. So be aware and then report the situation. The problem can't be solved until it's reported. If the person that you're concerned about is in imminent risk or danger, please just call 911. If you are concerned about an older adult and it's not imminent, you can file a report with the Division of Aging Services and Adult Protective Services. And the phone number is 866-552-4464. Your report is confidential, so please make a report if you're concerned. If you're in a long-term care facility or residence, like a personal care home or nursing home, a senior living community, the healthcare facilities regulation is responsible for, it's the DCH, healthcare facilities regulation is responsible for investigating reports in facilities. The number is 800-878-6442. And then again, if you or someone you know needs an advocate in a long-term care community, call your local long-term care ombudsman who's authorized to advocate and receive special training to advocate for residents in long-term care. So you can find your local long-term care ombudsman by calling your area agency on aging. And the number I will link to in the show notes as well. There's also the Office of the State Long-Term Care Ombudsman, and that phone number is 1-866-552-4464. I'll link to these resources in the show notes. So please join me in raising awareness about elder abuse and what you can do about it. Please don't turn a blind eye. Please listen in and tune in for the future episodes about financial exploitation with the Schottenstein family, and then resources to reduce the risk of financial exploitation with Dr. Peter Lichtenberg when we talk about his olderadultnestegg.com program. So with older adults who require assistance, like they have a medical condition that requires assistance or a cognitive condition like a dementia disorder that requires assistance, it can help to inquire about elder abuse separate from caregivers. And this gets tricky, but I had a situation where there was an older adult in a healthcare system I was working in who had a professional caregiver with him all the time. She sort of demanded, maybe not demanded, that's a strong word. She asserted herself by saying that he needed her to be in these appointments and kind of ingratiated herself. And so was in all of his medical and mental health appointments to help him communicate and to assist him. And a couple of months later, it came out that she had been exploiting him and had been found liable for abuse and exploitation. He did not, in the medical appointments and mental health appointments with her present, he did not feel able and safe or secure to reveal what was happening. It was only in a private meeting that, and I think after an APS report from an Adult Protective Services report, and I'm not even sure who made that report, that the case was investigated and she was found liable. I met with him after this situation occurred, and he shared with me that he didn't feel safe to reveal to any of the medical and mental health providers that she was exploiting him, that there would be more harm for him if he were to do that in her presence. And so one thing that I encourage mental health and medical providers and senior care providers to do is to have a brief meeting separately with the older adult or with an adult who might have a disability separately, just to inquire about their safety and sense of security and any risk for exploitation. This gets tricky in the context of dementia when there can be some delusions around financial mismanagement and concerns around financial mismanagement. And that's what makes, this work very tricky, and also what makes having a community of collaborators and other professionals to help you think through and to consult with. So I really encourage that as well. When I've had difficult adult protective services or adult abuse and neglect cases, I always rely on my team. It's one of the hardest things to do to recognize abuse or neglect, and I want to be sure that I am covering all of the bases and making sure that the older adult is safe and secure, and really using the team of professionals around me to support me and to support the older adult. So rely on your team, use your team, use the team of professionals to support you, to carry the weight of this painful situation, and to make sure that the older adults and caregivers get the support and care that they need so that everybody has a healthy and safe and happy life. That's all for today. Just a reminder, if you're a licensed mental health provider looking for continuing education focused on mental health and aging, simply go to mentalhealthandaging.com to learn more about how to earn your CEUs. Calling all mental health providers. Have you been feeling ineffective, stuck, or unsure of how to best help your client with memory loss? Well, it's not your fault. Most therapists haven't had any training in addressing memory loss or cognitive changes in therapy. But I got something for you. In my free 10-minute video where I walk you through 5 steps for helping your clients presenting with memory loss, you'll learn the difference between memory loss and mental health concerns for older adults and how to help. Get this free training and a bonus workbook that you can start using in your clinic today. Simply go to www.mentalhealthandaging.com/clarity to learn more. That's www.mentalhealthandaging.com/clarity, CLARITY.